Alrighty, I just made a 30-minute video for the quiz 4 and pressed the wrong button. So I have to start over again. At least I know what I said. So this week you have more, I think, interesting reading. Perhaps not as controversial as some of the stuff material you read last week. But still, I mean, no one gets killed. No woman kills her husband in this one, but we still have some of the same problems, and then others as we talk about the Japanese literature and a couple of the Indian stories for you to read. And as you know, as I told you, there's a lot of material not required this time around. But you might take a look at Einem. It's a story from Indonesia. It's very, very unpleasant, but indicative of a lot of things that are happening now in the world. And as a couple people have noted on the discussion threads, these stories might be written a few years ago, sometimes 15, 20. And the tragedy is that these kinds of situations have not improved to the point of with equality. And it continues all the way from genital mutilation to allowing women to drive in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. So that Saudi Arabian poem, Mother's Inheritance, unfortunately still has a lot of tread on it. And so does a story like Wildflower. It's a sweet young girl. And she doesn't have any say in anything that goes on. She is at the whim of the father, and the father wrings his parma as a symbolic of the tears, if you will, that his friend has shed over his wife. And at the funeral of the wife, and says, here's something to assuage your grief. Sweet little teenager, and of course they wait until she reaches past puberty, so that at least they do that, so she's not handed over when she's 11 years old or 10 or 9, which often happens. But still, she leaves the rural area of that Wildflower and is sort of transplanted. And tries to be a good girl. I mean, there's another woman, much more westernized, if you will, who talks to her, maybe even condescends. She likes her a little bit. I mean, she's a sweet girl with lots of bells and ornaments, and believes, what she's raised to believe, that, maybe city girls can learn to write, but that's not the way it is for little girls, for girls. So they shouldn't do that. And then whether it's through some magical tea or whatever it might be, the young girl, Angori, falls in love. And as I mentioned in other places, that this kind of a love is often antithetical to community interests, because the accent falls on the I as opposed to the we. And so that last thing that happens in the story I find really interesting, is that she asked the narrator to teach her how to write her name, which is quite remarkable, and also, wonderfully symbolic of the whole idea of a person's identity. And love, of course, is predicated on selfish feelings. It is a big issue still. I mean, if you're going to talk about conflicts, whether it's gender, whether it's tradition versus modernity, all these kinds of things, you're going to find so many of the stories will concentrate on families. All right, the Greeks like to concentrate on tragic families, and to make their point. And in this particular case, she represents a lot of women. I'm reminded of a story called "Marriage is a Private Affair" that I think it was probably linked early on in the African literature in this section of when I discussed in the notes Chinua Achebe, the late Chinua Achebe, And in this story, a young boy has gone from the village and moved into the city. And there he's gone to school and he's met a very intelligent woman, an intellectual companion and things like this. And he writes to his father that he wants to marry. And his father says, "Oh, yeah, sure, I have the perfect woman for you back here." And it's someone he knows that's not, let's say, the brightest bulb, but she knows her Bible and she'll be a good housekeeper and raise the kids. And he's not interested. He's interested in more than that. And he tells the father, "Marriage is a private affair. I get to choose." And the father says, "No, no, no, no. It is a private affair, but it's my affair. I choose, and your mother choose a wife for you." The boy ends up marrying the girl. There's years that go by until finally the father relents and meets his grandson. And of course, everybody's happy then, and he determines to try to make up for what he has done to the family because of his intransigent ways. Such is the power of tradition. You have a poem there. Amrita Pritam is the name of the author who wrote Wildflower. And in that poem, she's compares writing songs and poems to flicking a cigarette ash. And that might be all that goes into the creation of art and whatnot. I mean, by the way, she's also written, if you look her up, some very, very beautiful love poems about her husband, and she's led a very good life in these. You don't let me think that all the time that everybody who's the author of these stories is miserable or anything like that. That's not the case. Another story from India is Fall, My Mother. And this is an interesting one in a number of different ways. And when you're reading that story, look at how closely, I mean, the beauty from the little girl's perspective, who's writing later on, maybe having come to understand her mother a little bit better, and the social kinds of strictures and whatnot. They always treat the girl, like she's just this jewel. The girl knows nothing about womanhood. Thus, during the feast of Diwali, this is a huge, huge Hindu feast, and I know when my wife and I 3 years ago were in Trinidad for a literature conference, and we happened to be there right at the time of Diwali, and the prime minister, I think, is a woman, and she's Indian, and the whole country basically stops for Diwali. And this is a huge festival of the lights, and while the girl is up in the tree and whatnot, she experiences her first menstrual cycle and doesn't have any idea what this is. As I recall in there, the only other time she's seen blood like this in her protected life is that a man had fallen and cracked his skull on a curb or a rock, and there was a lot of blood. And the man probably died, and there's a certain kind of symbolic death here and rebirth into I'm not sure what, because the world definitely turns upside down. The mother is not sympathetic, and the father calls the young narrator. He says, "You can no longer dress this way. You have to do these things." He calls her the dark one. And in the beginning of the story, the parents, when the girl suffers this surprise, I mean, it'd be incredibly frightening. She's bleeding and doesn't know what's going on. The mother and the father are off trying to negotiate a different marriage for somebody else who has something a little bit wrong with them. I can't remember, is it epilepsy? I have to reread the story this week. But Dark One is something she's not heard before. She's only heard these wonderful things from her mother about what a precious thing she is, and this now suddenly she's a commodity because getting someone to marry her is not going to be so easy because of her dark skin. And as I think I said in the introduction to the week, the Brahmins are supposed to be fairer skinned, and this is before the whites even arrived in India. And so the idea is now she's a commodity. Now she's going to go on the marriage market, and she's not going to fetch a very good price, if you will. Or they're going to have to pay a lot of money to get someone to marry her. Now that The Japanese two stories and one poem, the one poem about generations, is not all saying that everything's bad in Japan, but there is a lot of criticism about this working yourself to death, and which the narrator of the poem seems to be doing. When you look at what's happened in the past, and a lot of criticism now about the ideas of, everybody has to go on vacation at the same time with the company, and of course, in many cases, the woman is excluded from these things. And as I told you on the first one, is that there's a good Japanese movie. There are many good Japanese movies to watch. One of them that you might like is called Shall We Dance? There's an American version of it, but look at the Japanese version. This is about waltzing, but you get the idea of the plight of the salaryman in Japan, working his bones, working himself to death to make sure they can afford the house, having to get up at 3 in the morning and get the train in, and then come back and have just enough time to maybe eat something and fall asleep again and start up again, and of course go out with your fellow workers afterwards drinking. So you'll find a lot of that going on in the literature. Now, Yukio Mishima is one of the more enigmatic figures of Japanese literature and politics. We would call him incredibly right-wing. He hated the Americans' Constitution. He wanted to reinstate the emperor to the emperor's former and full glory. But on the other hand, his house was very Western. He was bisexual and was a samurai. He wanted to reinstitute all the samurai traditions, which don't really fit in with homosexuality. He did marry an arranged marriage. His mother, he said, "I don't care, just find someone who's shorter than me." And he, with all his macho and bellicosity, and looking back on this more militaristic tradition that he wanted reinstilled into Japan to have pride, he managed to avoid serving in the armed forces during the Second World War or the Pacific War. A lot of people said he faked tuberculosis. So he's just an interesting, and he also starred in the movie of patriotism, which is about someone who commits harikari. Actually, it's two people. And everything has to be done perfectly, because there's a picture, I think, over, maybe I don't know, there's a fireplace, but there's a picture of the young man and Raiku, the wife, and while she's there, and she's the loyal wife, and everything they do is to show the justice of that picture that's on the mantle, and everything has to be done for the emperor, who is the sun god. So their duty is to be wonderful lovers. That's where this eroticism comes in, because she's, if you look at it with reading where it's going to be cut and everything, Reiko's when she got married, got a gift of a knife to commit suicide, seppuku, and then she does diligently, and the entire time the husband is doing it, is cutting himself. She's his second, and the only thing she does is to loosen his collar of his uniform while he's opening himself up. And then when he's dead, she positions herself in the right place so that when she dies, when people come in, they're going to be able to see this perfectly done suicide. Now, why? These couple they haven't been married 6 months. His soldier friends have, in fact, protected him from their mutiny, because they don't, because he's just married and whatnot. But he finds out he's going to have to go with the imperial forces and kill these guys. Now, this is based on an actual story from around World War I or something, I believe, and the soldiers were, in this particular case, were revolting or mutinying because they wanted a stronger military and things along these lines. And the head people basically made use of them to achieve their own political ends. But he's talking about a different kind of patriotism from what we get in our novel. And while he may not, the thought of fighting against his own friends uh, is appalling to him. Um, the real problem, I think, and you read and see what you think, is the fact that he can't stand to think of emperor's soldiers fighting one another. This is, beyond the pale. And so he decides he only can do one thing to show his great loyalty, because he won't fight, is to do a perfect suicide. And again, it's all a conduit for the emperor. And this is what the author sees as missing in Japanese culture. He wants to go back to the warrior kind of cult that our novel says is responsible for great destruction. And to give you an idea, in Patriotisms, Raiko describes her husband as, a great sun-like principal with a gleaming sun chariot. She will gladly ride to her destruction. I mean, a complete subservience to the idea. Even when they make love, the idea is they're praising by their enjoyment. It's all supposed to show their loyalty to the emperor, every aspect of life. Then you have a little bit of a different spin on here. In Spring Rain, Natsuo is like so many people. She's raised to be the Japanese woman, very passive and whatnot, but through her acting, um, she's able to, reach into her inner self that maybe she can't, that persona she has to keep hidden in public, and reaches out. And we see that she's a bit of a little rebel too, or has a streak in her of desiring individuality. And when she smokes a cigarette while standing up, a good lady would never do that. You would sit in a chair docilely and smoke in your seat, but not standing up. That's like, men do that, and men pee standing up, I suppose. But there is that kind of that everybody should have a place. But and you'd think that in the United States, at any rate, the idea is that Hollywood people are these liberals, despite John Wayne and Stewart and a bunch of other authors who were very, very, very actors who were very, very, very conservative. Here we find the husband. She's worried. That's why she's nervous. And I love that elevator that won't work, social mobility and difficulty. Spring is a time of rebirth and change, and things are changing, and maybe not the way her husband would like it. So when she comes home, that's why she's smoking and whatnot, is because she's afraid to tell her husband the good news, because she has a pretty good idea of how he's going to react. And we can see tears, she's sharpening that knife because she figures this guy's not going to be able to say one nice thing or do one nice thing. So when she gets home, she tells Yusuke that she failed with flying colors to make him happy. And then, of course, she eventually tells the truth, and they get the truth out, and he says, well, he's an aspiring screen or script writer. And he goes and looks at these Bergman and a couple of the others, Hollywood actors, where the actress was more popular than her husband, and that these marriages fell apart and things like this. So one of is the good possibility at this juncture that because of that she's one apart, and she's going to be more well known than him, that I think he says at the end, well, I'll come and watch you. But there's a question in the air: is this marriage going to survive this kind of turnover of what is a custom or customary? Now, you have, I think, 6 or 7 questions from the last parts of the novel, which I hope you've enjoyed. Mitsushima, he gives reasons. There are reasons that he decides to stay in Burma. to bury the Japanese soldiers, but it's no way to avoid punishment for desertion. Now, there's a monk, a fake monk, who's doing exactly that, and then so the men come to think at one point that, my gosh, Mizushima is a deserter, but it's not also because uh, he remains in Burma because he's come to love the people and Buddhism, and he now cares little about Japan. He wants to go home. That's if he didn't, then there would be no sacrifice. The one thing he wants more than anything would be to go home, but now he sees that he owes these people, and this is a different kind of patriotism I put to you that from what you find in the story with the title. This is if he has to give up a lot to make what he does mean something. And so he will do, like he learned from the British, as ironically enough, is to honor the Japanese dead. And at one point, I believe he thinks he hears the voice in them, that they all died there, and many of them young and caught up with like drunken bullies, I think was one of the questions from last week. And so the troop of people, the men who are in the prison camp at Moudon, they go through these transformations, and they see him. They're walking across the bridge that they're having to build, and go, "Wow, look, that sure looks like Mizushima." And then the monk shows up to listen to their music, and they throw back some fruit to him, I believe. And that is he, as you probably come to realize. But at the end of the story, they send the bird. When they finally believe and they start getting their act together again, because he still is kind of the spiritual center, if you will, of this singing company. They remember they teach the green parrot or parakeet. It'll learn to say, "Let's go home to Japan together." And of course, he can't go with them. But he does in the letter that he gives the captain, and the captain reads the letter on the ship. They're left before they learn the truth, that he's not a deserter. As a matter of fact, he says in his letter, "After I became a real Burmese monk, the man known as Corporal Mizushima no longer existed." There's been a kind of a transformation here. And in the story, we find out everything. There's a repetition at the bridge of the monk coming to the fences by the camp. But we also find out what happened to him when he's trying to talk these soldiers into quitting. And of course, a lot of them don't want to quit because they're thinking, if we quit and we don't die, then we don't do justice to all the people who died. And Mizushima is almost talking in their mind treason when he says, "Well, there's no reason to do it anymore." And he sits there between with the fire going one way or the other with his harp, and his brave actions end up saving many lives. But he does get shot, and he falls over the side there and ends up with one of the funny parts of the novel is what happens with the cannibals. As I may have mentioned, you don't want to ask, where did that Burmese monk's garb come from in the first place? But he does escape, and it's not just because of his music. It's because the chief's daughter basically rescues him. But they're almost ready not just to eat him, but to put him to death because, my gosh, he does the music, and they think he's inspired by the spirits in the area. I'm thinking of the white things floating down in Avatar. The king wants to marry the daughter, but what do you mean you not cut anybody's heads off or anything like that? No, we can't have her marrying a coward. But because of the daughter, he's able to escape, and with the Burmese garb for a Buddhist, I should say Buddhist garb, into which he will grow and leave behind uh, the man he was by making a great sacrifice, which is a different kind of patriotism, because our novel does not point in the direction of the kind of samurai culture that we see is put up as a goal, or something that should, an ethos that should dominate the country. And this leaves it up in the air in the end. But we do have Mizushima, who is trying to do honor to the dead. Good and bad people, but they were killed in the war, and many of them horribly. So, on that upbeat note, I wish you all a good rest of the week, and hope everybody does a good job on the quiz. And let's see if I can press the right buttons this time so I don't mess with